In this book I was reading, The Psychology of Money, in one of the last chapters, he talks about like why everything happened the way it happened, and it's such an interesting chapter because it goes really into the psychology and history of things. And I'm like, wow, this is such good information that should be more widespread. I'm gonna try putting it in the most simplest form. And it was like after World War II, America was in a lot of debt, right? Trillions of dollars of debt. And they didn't know what to do with all the returning soldiers that came back that needed jobs because the war was over. They had nothing. They had no homes, nothing. And so they released the GI Bill, which allowed for real estate and homes and mortgages to be bought with no down payment for veterans and this and that. And they had a bunch of new jobs available because from the 1930s to 1950s, there was lots of innovations and factories being made, even though it wasn't heavily noticed because of, they were focused on the Depression and the war. But by the 1950s, they noticed all these new gadgets and stuff being made. And they also released, when the veterans came back, like I said, the GI Bill for it to get mortgages very easily. And they released a lot of lines of credit. So they allowed people to borrow more money from the banks and this and that, right? Because they needed to. And they essentially did this to relieve their 200 trillion dollars worth of debt because, for all the war expenses. And like I said, like all the gadgets that were being made caused all these veterans to get new jobs in these factories to make these toys and whatever gadgets and like air conditioning and all these new inventions that are made, along with lines of credit, which allowed them to buy all these things, whether they had the money or not, right? And also, they had low interest rates and they increased the income. So like a person who was making like 2,500 a month will start now making 4,500 a month. Their idea was to make the poor less poor, right? And so they did this. So with think about all the army the people that came back from all these veterans that came back, they were getting more money. They had jobs and they had lines of credit and they had the option to with the GI Bill to get real estate for cheap, right? And they did this for so long, right? And they said that from like 1935 or something, it was $29 billion worth of household debt, right? And then 20 years later, it went to $330 billion worth of debt, household debt. And I was like, yo, like if you think about it, that's obviously a big jump. And but it makes sense with all these new things that are coming out. They talked about like, the farmer was getting new tractors and the woman was getting her new white refrigerator and the man in the office was getting a new air conditioner and this and that, right? So it makes sense that how much people were buying and everybody was buying cars and houses, right? So people were taking out lines and lines of credit which they, owed very little interest rate on. It made sense for them to buy because they had the opportunity to, but this allowed for it's such a crazy like how he connects everything. But so all of that happened and it allowed, because debt was so low and the interest was so low, it allowed the poor to live like the rich because income was still very relatively high compared to how much debt they owed. So even if they're making like 4,500 a month because income increased, like I said, their debt was still relatively low because how low interest rates were. And with how much lines of credit they had, it didn't matter. So then he talked about like the rich and the poor were similarly living in sync. And the example he used was like every night they would, families would sit down and watch TV in the living room as we do right now with the Super Bowl. Everybody was essentially in sync, the rich and the poor. And over time, eventually things change and the economy changed. And he said like the rich experienced an 86% increase in income, and the poor in that same time period reached a 6% increase in income. And so obviously all these people have debt and the rich are like still living super like luxuries and stuff like that. So all these rich people are buying, and like in this time period, cars are becoming nicer, houses are becoming bigger, private schools are being made, all of this like expensive stuff, right? And given the time period before, they believed, regardless of people's jobs, the poor can live like the rich because that's what life would look like, right? Everybody was in sync. But after this change happened over the course of years, the rich started living exactly the way they were living, right? They're buying bigger homes, nicer cars, they're going on vacations, putting their kids in tuition, and Johnny down the block who was, and the example they used, like that rich person was like an investment maker making 900,000 a year or something, and Johnny down the block, not down the block, but Johnny who saw how these people were living was like, yo, I want to live like that, but he wasn't making 900,000 a year. He was making like $30,000-$40,000 a year, but because he had this idea that, oh, from his parents, that Americans, based even if they have different jobs, they can still live the same way because that's how that parent grew up, right, in that time period. So he was like, okay, I want to I'm gonna also lease 2 cars. I'm gonna go buy a big house. I'm gonna put my kids through expensive college tuition or whatever, right? Causing him to go in insurmountable amounts of debt that he can't afford. And all this happened because he's trying to keep up with the Joneses. And that's where that whole term comes from. And it's so crazy to me because all of that makes sense, right? And that's where the whole idea of keeping up the Joneses comes from. And the idea of like people going into so much debt nowadays. Like when I hear someone in real life talking about, oh yeah, I'm in so much credit card debt, I'm like, how the hell did that happen? You just how like when I grew up, the whole idea was only buy on credit card what you can afford with cash. So if I can buy $50 worth of food with my cash, put it on a credit card so you build credit, whatever, this and that. There's basic levels of credit, but it's like these people were trying to, you know, keep up because they kept comparing themselves, maybe because of what their parents taught them or jealousy or whatever the case may be, right? And it caused them to be in so much credit card debt, allowing for America to benefit off them because they're collecting so much money and interest. And this whole idea essentially stemmed from America knowing that consumer spending would be crazy amount, like very high amounts, because if you give the Americans or whoever humans the opportunity to buy things that they might need or want, they will buy it, right? And it allowed them to recoup as much funds. America's still in debt or whatever the case may be, right? But it allowed them to recoup the debts and fix the economy based on how much debt they went into from World War II, all just off of consumer spending, which is like crazy to think about. And it's like even nowadays you'll see like people who don't have enough money and they're like living paycheck to paycheck and they're trying to buy like Louis Vuitton and luxurious stuff and it's like a Benz or whatever, and they're like, why are you buying things that you can't really realistically afford? It's basic financial knowledge, but I feel like I can say that easily, but because maybe I have the relative financial literacy or the psychology or the logical sense, which for me, right, I don't care to like be like the Joneses or nothing like that, right? If I'm gonna be like the Joneses, I need to be making money like the Joneses, and it's that simple, right? I never had the idea to like keep up with them, but other people are not like that, whatever the case may be. But consumer spending is so nuts to me that it makes sense why like anyone who is financially literate will know not to go into debt unless it's good debt, like buying real estate or like everything like Robert Kiyosaki was talking about, rich dad poor dad. Like there are some forms of debt that are good, debt that allows you to create money while you're borrowing it, rather like going into business with bank's debt or buying a house with bank's debt. As long as it's creating you money, like giving you money, cash flow, then it's good. But if it's like consumer debt where you're just buying things just to buy things because maybe you want them, like a fucking air conditioner or a laundromat in your own house or whatever, like a washer dryer, it's like, yeah, those things are nice to have, but they're nice to have, they're not necessary. So don't go into debt buying them because you're just gonna end up having to continuously work to pay it off or whatever the case may be. But the fact that the government was able to like capitalize off the idea that, oh, if we do this and this, we know consumers will spend this much because that's just how they are, is one nuts to me. And I think that's like one of the main reasons why they don't teach finances and anything finance related in schools, because if they teach all of that, they will essentially create the people that are financially literate will talk to people that are financially illiterate. It doesn't matter how financially literate you are. Like, I don't think I'm that financially literate, but I know a decent amount, right? So when I talk to financially illiterate people, their ideas and thoughts on how they think about things make no sense to me at all. I'm like, how is that logical? How is that rational at all? You want to go into debt to pay for a car? You want to live paycheck to paycheck to pay for a car? So you can impress people? Like, that makes no sense to me at all, right? But if they taught finances and tax, like all the things that I took my own time to learn upon, which I think everybody should learn, everybody would become so financially literate, they wouldn't be able to take advantage of consumer spending and this and that or whatever the case may be. And like something like, it would create a whole chain of things. Like they wouldn't be able to take advantage of consumer spending. They wouldn't be able to stimulate the economy when new inventions are released. Something as simple as like CPAs wouldn't be able to make as much money because, or like accountants or finance people, because if everybody has knowledge, they wouldn't go to financial advisors, they wouldn't go to CPAs, they would just file taxes on their own, they would make their own investments. And like people that are financially literate typically have a good savings rate, they have a good bank account, they have investments, personal or through a advisor or whatever the case may be, right? But they have these things because they know that, and if your money works for you, you can't if you have your money working for you, that's the best way to do it, rather than just like leave it in a bank and let the banks make money off your money or whatever the case may be. And so if you think about it, everybody was financially literate, everybody was doing these things. How could the government really take advantage and create money and like collect money from everybody if everybody was like using all the tax deduction benefits and they were all having their own investments and everybody's money was working for themselves? Like a lot of people that don't have their money working for themselves, they're spending it because it's in their bank account so easily available. And you know, when you have investments and you have cash flow or whatever the case may be, you can technically, you have a sense of ease over like, oh, I don't need to work here. Oh, I can go start my own business because you know the best benefits of having your own business, or you have the financial security. I have my 6 months of expenses saved away. I have my investment that can take care of me if I really need the emergency. But if people that are doing that are tied to their job, so they can't ever take on the risk of quitting because they need the money, they need the paycheck, and that's what keeps the economy stimulating. They can't go through high amounts of unemployment because now businesses aren't booming, taxes aren't being collected, people aren't making money, people aren't working, and that's like the worst thing that can happen for the government. And that's why it makes sense that like during like Corona era, they were pumping out money because they wanted money to be stimulated back into the economy. It made no sense for the government to give everybody money because of unemployment. Like that whole concept makes no sense to me. If they don't have money, let them suffer, let them struggle, whatever. But it's like if you give them money, they'll spend it, which will come back to them in some form through taxes or booming up the businesses and letting the businesses pay taxes or whatever. I don't know exactly the way they do it, but the idea of the government who are in debt and they need money and they can't just print a bunch of it because of supply and demand, giving it out to the fucking everybody, and everybody was collecting that shit. So I'm telling you, you need to learn financial literacy on your own because schools won't teach it now and they won't teach it ever because it would make too much literate people and it wouldn't give the government the advantages they want. Don't trust the government. I'm telling you, they got some. We all know the government is not somebody you can trust. Like, you abide by them because you have to, but if you trust them, that's on you. Become financially literate. It'll change your life.